This session introducing Kusto, or KQL as you might have heard of it, is really a slide-thin session. We will be going into different variations of Kusto, first of all in the Azure Portal, but also with PowerShell, how can we interact with applications insights and so on, and also a little bit of Azure DevOps on how to actually interact with that again. So in no particular order, but more sort of a progression towards the more advanced stuff, we will be looking at KQL from the most basic point of view, and then onto some advanced stuff. And we will be touching alerts via the Azure Portal as well, and then moving on to exporting and reporting with KQL. A little bit about me. As Mark said, I work as a BI dude. It's because I can't really pin down what I'm actually doing, so it's a fuzzy, vague kind of description. My interests are broad. I have somewhat specialization in analysis services and Power BI, but have a thing for Azure DevOps and C# and IoT and other stuff as well. So I'm kind of all over the place. I've been working in the BI industry for over 15 years with healthcare, transportation, government, and finally retail, as we do here in Catman Solution. So our main platform is based upon kind of a web job, Azure Function, Logic Apps, kind of data ETL application, where we handle retail data from various suppliers for the retail industry. We have about 60 clients where we have some Azure SQL databases in an elastic pool, and we process all the data that they actually apply through our system. That ends up in analysis services and finally into Power BI, where we service and support reports as well as provide a basic package of reporting for the solution. Obviously, application insights is a thing for us because we want to know what's going on in our application. And that's where KQL or Kusto comes into play, because we actually want to monitor and query not only telemetry, but actions and events within our application in a timely manner. So as soon as we've been on a journey, as well as many others, moving from on-premises to the cloud. And as we did, Kusto was kind of the natural way of going forward. So we've been playing around with application insights and Kusto for a little over a year and a half. So it's not like I'm the super knowledge guy on the topic, but I know my way around and I can get some reports done as well. So that's my input for it. So what's Microsoft's take on where does Kusto fit into the Azure framework, so to speak? They want to have this, they want to serve this up as Azure Monitor, which is the umbrella service name for a lot of different services, actually, application insights, log, workspaces, and so on. But in the end, these two metrics and logs are the main interest of area for us in this situation, because that's where we can actually query with KQL. So either you have Azure services that actually provide a way of actually logging telemetry and events into Azure Monitor, or you can customize and set up your own database, so to speak. So there are two ways actually, and now I hope that you can follow me along into the Azure portal. I'm just going to log into our tenant. And in here, I can create a new application insights database or service. And as you can see, we have quite a few for testing and so on. But actually, I can just choose create a new resource group for this, and I can call it Pass Hybrid. And I want to place it into North Europe just to be. I can go through validation, and it's not really a much troubled setup for this. And while we wait for the deployment of this service to go along, we're already there. I can go to my resource and now I can actually instrument my application. If I have a .NET application or any kind of application, I can actually instrument that using Application Insights. And Application Insights logs into a log that is under the Azure Monitor umbrella. And that's where I can actually extract what I'm logging into my Application Insights out using KQL. One thing that you will want to notice about the Application Insights service is the instrumentation key. That's something you want to use to actually locate your way into which application insights are you logging into. So the instrumentation key is an important key. I will just copy that off to the side. And as an example, I have here a basic PowerShell script where I've pasted in my instrumentation key, and then I build up a PowerShell object, and actually I can invoke a web request towards Azure and then log into the application directly. So we saw down here we got status code 200, which means the web request was accepted. And if we go in, there's a bit of a lag in here. So if we go into the logs, we can see that we are prompted with all kinds of pre-baked queries that will suit many needs if you have the basics or standard services within Azure. More and more services are actually going that way. Now I can't remember if it's custom events. I think it is custom events that, yeah. So we see here now that I have logged one event in here, and I can actually, this is a JSON object, so I can actually put in any attributes and values that I'd like to see as part of my object that I log into the application insights database. But this was the first example of a Kusto query. So this is the SQL equivalent of a select star from any table. So I have my, you can call them tables over here, where I logged into my custom events. And now the time range is set up here. And you wanna look into limiting your query output at some point, because now I only have one event in here, but if you have a chatty application, then there are restrictions on to how many results you can actually return from a query. And the portal will warn you and address you if you overflow those limits. I can't recall off the top of my head what they are, but you will be notified. As you can see down below, you will be prompted for items per page and number of pages and so on. I believe the max is 10,000 records. But a nice addition was actually this pane that was not always there, but it tells you something about how the query went along, and was it parallelized, or number of workspaces, do you span different workspaces, age of the processed data, and so on. So that's a nice information on the query part of that. So that was the first KQL of this session. And we will move along to actually a lot of the services, as I mentioned, in Azure are moving towards logging into Application Insights or Azure Monitor. And that's where we actually use or leverage in our daily work. So we use obviously a full stack of Azure services. We are completely Microsoft house. So all of our applications can be monitored using this. But let's have a look at a very basic statement. So we have an application insights, which is called DevOps. And as you can see, there are different tables in here. Some of those are pretty standard. It comes with the package, so to speak. So when I create a new application insights log space, these tables become available and you can log into those. I have then custom metrics, and our applications are logging into these tables. So if I run this, you can see that we have a lot of incoming source data events. And obviously we have a lot of events in here. So if I quit or comment out the where clause, you can see a lot of events are going on in here. But if I only want the incoming source data, I can use a where clause, as you see. Especially for the where clause, I can actually put that in a number of times. So KQL will fix that for me when I execute the code. Obviously, I can order values descending or ascending by any column that I wish. And I can also summarize and then bucket over a time span of 30 minutes. This is the case here. And then I can convert that into a chart and see, oh, so during the day, this is the number of average files or average incoming source data elements that we received for this particular application. So that's pretty quick, a pretty quick way of actually monitoring and visualizing your telemetry on your application. I can also specify the rendering within the query. So if I take another application and I want to see what's inside here, I can see that we have a process called tabular database processed, or that's an event. And we can see that this event has what's called a custom dimension. And in here, we can see that we have added objects into the JSON. So what database was it? What was the duration of the processing? And an internal process execution ID. So we can wrap up that workflow nicely afterwards, and then a timestamp on when it's done. But I can actually address that in my query so that I can extend duration from within this object. So we see I have duration milliseconds in here in my custom dimensions. So I can actually dot my way into that attribute here and then convert it to a string or int or whatever I like. And then I get it as a column on my query. Now, there's too much information going on in this query, so I just project timestamp and a conversion of the duration to a value. And finally, I want to render that as a column chart. And that's how we kind of implement within the query itself how we want it visualized. So there are several options for charts and so on. Unfortunately, pie chart is one of them. So we're not quite rid of that yet, but we're getting there, I guess. So the project, as we just saw it, was kind of a way to, if we just take the full query of custom metrics here, and then again, filter on incoming source data, I get a lot of columns here that I'm not really interested in. So I can actually just say I want timestamp, name, and value, or I can go the other way and say I don't need client browser, client city, client or country or region, and client IP. So those are filtered away. I get the rest of the columns that are in the table, so to speak. Also extend, which was the one we saw before. I can extend, or there's even more powerful JSON methods in KQL. I won't be going into those currently, but there's ways to actually manipulate the JSON within KQL. Also, we can have partitions of data returned to us. So let's just see what the result is without. So we can see I get a lot of requests per second, before I get to the next request in application queue, I can then say, okay, so you can partition by name, which is this column, top 10 by value. And my value is out here. Maybe it's not meaningful to order by value in this case, but you'll get the sense of it once you see the results. So now I only get 10 results returned for each name category, so to speak, which can be quite nifty as well. And we got this, summarize, yes. And obviously, I can also add in some, they've actually implemented some nice time management, so to speak. As we can see right now, the time range in here is last 24 hours. There are some presettings up here, but I can also address that in the query itself. So custom metrics has a column or attribute called timestamp. I can actually say timestamp is greater than, and then ago 1 day. So now I only get data returned that is from within the first, or it's fresher than a day old. I can also say 1 hour. I can say 10 hours. I have various options actually to actually say, okay, I want this to be between this and that time period. I can manipulate my where clause in that way as well. So you can see the difference easily now. So it was from 10 in the past query, and now it's from 12 and going onwards. So where do we apply this? Actually, we have a range of dashboards where we actually monitor our applications and the ETL flow of our data. And as you can see here, there's some more advanced stuff in KQL. And as I spoke earlier, there's some parse JSON, which can actually pass out the JSON that is in the custom dimensions. And we invoke that function and into the object JSON, and then we can actually dot our way into the different attributes that we want to have exposed. This is just like in SQL, referencing a column and then calling as job execution ID, as function, as timestamp, and so on. Should be quite obvious what goes on here. And then we actually want this to it's a bit cumbersome query just to actually show you how many files have we been processing for this application over the last 90 days. But there are some different logging issues, so we need to filter out specifically which files we need and so on. But if we run this query, you can see that if we pull out this, we have actually a range of 90 days processed, and if we can take it step by step. And as Pedro asks, it's a read-only language, and we might get back to that because you can actually create stuff within Kusto, but you cannot persist it, to my knowledge. And this is where it gets a bit cumbersome to work in a browser like this, but I know that actually Azure Data Studio is working on supporting Kusto, so that might be a little bit easier because now I have to uncomment every single line in here. There is no way of uncommenting or commenting multiple lines. So this also shows that this is a fairly new language. So now we see the max of 10,000 items returned down at the bottom, 10,000 plus records. And now you can see that the portal is actually saying, to improve your query, narrow down this result set. And then obviously we can narrow down. But now you see that the custom dimensions in here is actually quite chatty. So we have a couple of attributes in here, and we want to extend that, which just extends, let's say, the inner workings into a JSON object. And then we can dot our way into all of these and have them displayed as columns. Oh yeah, I have to project them first. So week and message and solution ID is the one we're projecting out. You can see here. These are the ones that we get. And then we actually want to extract this message and have it extract this kind of asterisk or wildcard search and so on. So we can actually pin out that we only wanted the files that are data loaded from, and then some kind of name. So we see here, which is a table. So we only want the events where the message is data loaded from, and then some kind of staging table. And we want to count the.
Sorry, yeah, and that string is regex, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
It is. And that's a one nifty thing about KQL as well, that it supports regex. And I know this will divide people into two groups, those who hate regex and those who don't. Every time I have to do regex, I have to relearn it. So it's not my favorite thing, but I recognize the power of regex once it's actually unfolded. Our own application, our own ETL framework is actually heavily dependent on regex. So we have a couple of guys in here who is actually phenomenal at that. So I have a couple of go-to guys for that, which is my luck. So we want to test where this is non-empty, so we only get the files or the events where we actually match the regex expression, and then we actually project that out in here. And then we have a situation where we can actually load the same file multiple times due to different alterations of master data or issue fixes or so on. So in theory, it's the same, or in practice, it's the same table, it's different data. So we need to have a distinct selection of that. So we only count where it actually matters. And then we summarize all of that count file into number of files. So now we get, for the past 90 days, for this solution, we processed 27,015 files. We also use it for different alerting queries, so to speak. So we actually provide a number. You can see here we have solution ID and attempts. And we want a warning flag once the number of attempts to actually load a file exceeds some kind of level. And once you've created the query that actually gives you what you want, you can actually just click here on create an alert rule for selected query. That takes you to another screen. And you select the scope, it's already selected for you, and then you have to configure the condition. So as we can see before, we see our query in here, and we see that this is the evaluation that it suggests. Sorry for that. And the alert logic you can set up here at the bottom. So it's number of results or metric measurement. Number of results can be greater than, let's say, 50 in this case. And then you want that query to be run over a evaluation period and with some frequency. How often do you want it run? So the period in minutes, and obviously this has to align, so you can't choose anything silly. But you want it to span 120 minutes, and you want it to run every 5 minutes, so to speak. And that's where you want to match your threshold value with that. But if you do this, if we do kind of set up this condition, we can select an action group. And if there's no action group selected in here, we can have one created. So you want to create a specific action group, which is the equivalent of having a collection of emails. So you can actually say, okay, so you want an alert for this rule to be set to these people. So you can have either support or admins or something like that. And then Azure generates an email to those people based on whenever this threshold is exceeded. And as you can see, the estimated monthly cost is 150, which is acceptable, I guess. You can specify all kinds of alert rule name, description, and so on. And some of those you can't change afterwards. So if you specify a specific condition in here and state the same in the alert rule name, and you change the condition afterwards, you can't change the rule name. So if you say, whenever application X exceeds 10 items of blah, 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 and you actually only have 5 in here, then it's misleading to the ones who are receiving the messages. So it's something to take into consideration on how to name the rules. I will discard this one. Again, we can see that a spread of our solutions on which ones are actually creating more attempts than others. Why is that? We can go into that. Another way of actually saying something about time, as you can probably recognize, this is a query that actually counts the same number of files as before, but not where it's from the last 90 days. It's actually from the start of week, from now, and plus 1 day. So we want to have this for the current week running. How many files have we processed for this solution in that time span? So the queries are identical, except for the where clause where we actually just, query over a different time period. One of the more tricky ones is actually where and this is where there is some read write. I can actually create a data table within KQL. As you can see here, it's similar to Power Query, let, and then solutions be equals to data table, then a short bracket, and then I can actually create my values in here. So these are the clients that we are monitoring currently. And we create kind of a table using that. Then in here, I'll just see if I can maximize this to avoid this history. Yeah. I'll just manage the navigation. So we see the let solutions be equal to a data table with these columns and these data types. And then I can add in my values in here. And then I get on with my real query, so to speak. So I have a weekday, which is this, end of last week, which is this, start of last week, which is this. And then I go on querying my custom events down here, where timestamp is greater than or equal to start of last week, and timestamp is less than or equal to end of last week. Then I extend the JSON, which is in the custom dimensions. I then project some of those out. I again use regular expression to extract only the events that I want. I summarize then files last week. Let's see if I can't minimize this one. So I count file by week and solution ID and summarize files last week average. And then I average files last week, which is the one that I just created up here by solution ID. I then join custom events, this query on a new query on custom events, where I do almost exact the same, only the timestamp is greater than end of last week. So if you noticed, this has to be start of last week and less than end of last week. So I want this to be past end of last week. So I'm trying to actually compare 2 weeks of data in one data set. So now I go down and summarize files this week. So now I have files last week at an average and files this week, which is the count of files in this query. I can then join those two queries on solution ID. I project away, meaning I take all of the columns except for solution ID 1, which is one that is generated from the one side of the join. I then extend %done, which is files this week over files last week average. And then I sort by solution and project out %done in the end, as well as solution. So this is a way to track how is our client progressing. So if we yeah, that's right. So if you just hit run up here, it's gonna act up because we didn't select all of it. It doesn't quite know what to make of a let statement and so on. So if we select all of it, it's actually able to run. So that's one gotcha, that you have to select all if you have let statements in your query. So as you can see, some of our clients send in more files this week than last week, and some are below threshold, still not there. But this is an example of a semi-advanced query where we want to, compare week over week. I believe we have it in our dashboard out here as, like this. So we can actually have a comparison, files loaded on Mondays, files loaded on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, or Sundays. So this is another example of a similar query where we actually bring back numbers from different weeks and then bundle them up into, on days. You can, as we saw here, pin to dashboard, which is an option you get within the query. And that actually lets you select what kind of dashboard or which dashboard do you want to pin it to. You have 6 subscriptions, all resource groups, and then there are these kind of dashboards that I can pin it to. And when I do, it's kind of fixed. So if I save this sales loading progress query and change it, it's not going to change how it looks in the dashboard because this query is actually fixed. So the query is stored with the dashboard, as you can see here. So that's another gotcha that if you save your queries and fiddle around with them and save and expect that to be reflected in the dashboard, that's not so. You have to repin it to a dashboard. So we also have a direct link into our Elastic pool. So resource utilization for our Elastic pool is actually also just something we can tap into. Maybe we should go in and see that. So this is just an example of an Azure service where we actually just get it out of the box. So let's see, we can have this one. It's the production setup. So we can either go into the logs of the specific database, which is now we get this prompted for example queries. Unfortunately, they only have example queries for managed instance, but fear not. We have here metrics for our SQL Server database. And you can see all the different metric names we can actually monitor within here. And this is just it's not creating a query, it's just filtering the result set. So a database on its own is actually, logging into Azure Metrics, also Azure Activity and Diagnostics. And if you want to move a step up, we can go into the Elastic pool and see how that's actually faring along. And then we can get rid of this. And as you can see, this opens up a number of objects over here. And as you can see, this can be quite overwhelming to actually open up the first time. And where do I actually find my logs or what I want to do? Oh, App Metrics is not the one. It's called Azure Metrics in here. Before, I was only able to see metrics for the specific database. Now I should be able to see for the pool. So this is data from the pool itself. As you can see, CPU limit used and so on. Metric name. And then maybe last 4 hours. And then we can see and that's where my Microsoft Edge browser is getting a bit annoying. I'm not sure it's something in general with this interface. I believe it's just my laptop. And as you can see, 233 records for the last 4 hours. This shouldn't be something very tedious. Yeah, like that. So we have a query on CPU used on our Elastic pool. Pretty easy to dig into your analytics. Obviously, there are some restrictions on how much data is actually stored in here, and those numbers I can't really recall, but I believe it's something around 90 days of data. You can actually extend those into external repositories. So you can either send it to an event hub. You can also see log analytics, archive in a storage account, and send to an event hub. So these are the 3 options you generally get: log analytics, storage account, and then an event hub. A final wrap up is maybe a way to actually create events within a specific database from different applications. We already saw the PowerShell way of actually, without even installing anything else than PowerShell, actually just invoke the web request and then create an event within application insights. But Azure DevOps has some ways of actually interacting with that as well, and that's also one way of actually adding telemetry to your deployment pipelines or processes or releases. Also, out of the box, there's nothing really in here in Azure DevOps other than actually there's a component where you can, let's just see where we can, so app insight application. Yes, this one, release annotation. So this is the only component or the only task within Azure DevOps where you can actually interact with application insights. And this lets you add a JSON object to a specific instrumentation key. But if we use an agent specification of 2019, let's just make that bigger. Windows 2019, we can actually, with the Azure PowerShell, create an inline script where we actually just create a new object of the telemetry client, which is the .NET implementation. So you can also implement and instrument your .NET applications as well. But then the instrumentation key is taken from the variables. And then I can say more bad things happened. I can catch that exception that I throw in here, and then I can create a exception telemetry with the exception and put it as a track exception on the app inside client here, and then flush it and exit one, which means that this will fail. So I can actually, from within Azure DevOps, based on variable settings, throw or not throw anything to application insights. So if we just change, now we created a new, let's just see over here, this one 45 minutes ago, the instrumentation key here. Let's just paste that in there, save, okay. And then create a release, and we know it's gonna fail. So this one, dummy release, is queued. We can actually follow along in the pipeline. It's gonna fire up the agent, and then we might wanna go back into here and shut this one. And then we can track exceptions in here. So you can see no results for the last 24 hours. I'll just get that down to 30 minutes. And this one, I'm always confused if it's actually auto updating or it's just waiting. So I usually just refresh. I'm still waiting to connect. It's in progress now. So it's starting up the PowerShell script, some PowerShell behind the scenes. And then we see more bad things happened, and PowerShell exited with code 1. Well, maybe we'll take some questions because this was actually, well, not quite. Actually, there's one more thing that I wanted to show. So here we have a query, and I would actually like to export that into a Power BI M query so that I can update this outside of Azure. What this does is that it generates an M query, and the important stuff is right here. So this is actually the query that I wrote in here. It's, well, not a big portion of the M query, but a lot of it is actually explanations and so on. So I can fire up my Power BI desktop. It's just clicking up. Let's see if it's there. Yeah, so it's in here now. The exception that we just fired, more bad things happened. And I believe you can see Power BI now. And I want to get data, and I want a blank query. No. There you go. I then hit the advanced editor. I copied the text from the file. I paste it in. I click done. And it says, give me some credentials, please. I edit the credentials. You're already signed in. I hope the current user is not signed as a different user. And this, you can actually sign in into different tenants if you want to. But obviously I want a user that is allowed to browse that data. And sometimes this query actually returns an error, and then you have to go into data source settings and edit permissions, and then mess with the privacy level because not always set correctly. But there we have our data in Power BI. And let's see if we can execute the query. Loading data into the model. And we can have our data in Power BI. So I think that was it for my presentation, 2 minutes short. I'll be happy to answer any questions that I that I might get.
Thank you very much, Jens. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there to play with, I think. So some of the questions that I've got here, you've kind of answered them, but so I'll try not to re-ask those questions, but I might try and give us a different slant to them. First question I have is at the very start of this presentation, you created an application insight resource. How many
Yes.
do you need? And what's the reason to have them?
In fact, you only need one. But if you have chatty applications, you can opt for multiple in order to actually, not having to where clause your way out of any reporting on top of that. So it makes sense to actually collect telemetry and events from data applications that have interfaces or are a part of a complete solution. But other than that, you're free to take as many application insights as you want or as few. But in some cases, it makes sense to split up because maybe the telemetry doesn't have anything in relation, and that's why you want it separate.
Just another quick question on that that's just come to me. So could you just use one application insight to monitor across multiple subscriptions, or would you need one per subscription?
You can use one because it's the instrumentation key that is actually the binding parameter. So it's subscription independent, so to speak.
Perfect.
So you can collect data from services, or maybe not the ones. We can test that out quickly. This is on a different tenant, and here we have analysis services. And if I want to see diagnostic settings here, I believe I can only select. No, I can actually select from different subscriptions as well.
Okay, cool.
So should be subscription independent. Obviously, you should have access to set subscription in order to configure the application for that.
Yeah. Perfect. So as a SQL, I don't know if you describe yourself as a SQL person, but I possibly would, or historically a SQL person. Are you happy with Kusto as a new tabular style language, or do you think that a more SQL-like language would have been a better idea? In other words, how are you finding it?
Well, I actually found now my query languages span more than SQL. It's also DAX and MDX. So
Yeah,
I've been used to a bit of a variation on that part, and I actually think that the piping and the PowerShell way of actually extending a result into a new result and so on is actually quite nifty. So you have some similarities in naming stuff, where clause, and you have some SQL familiarity. But if you just Google for a cheat sheet, you will quickly be on your way to actually translate what you would have done in SQL to KQL.
excellent. That's good.
So there are several resources for that, translation in all over the web. So you should be quite okay.
Cool. So you've answered the next question about language references. And so you mentioned about the piping or the pipeline that's very much PowerShell-like. Sort of on that, is it possible to have a complex KQL script so that you can do conditional logic? I think it says and storing result sets to variables. I think you showed the storing to variables and
Yeah.
manipulating them before outputting to screen. So I guess that question really is can you do
Uh,
conditional logic
yes.
that you
Let's see
know
if
of?
we can go back to that query. Yeah, this one maybe.
That's right.
Oh, so
So
conditional
yeah,
logics. So like if statements and switch and so on.
exactly.
Yeah, that I actually don't know.
Because from that script, it almost looks like there seems to be a pattern where you know when you actually start doing the data set, it almost seems like one continuous pipe. But
Yes,
I guess
it
I
is.
guess that's something to. It'd be quite nice to be able to do conditional, though. I guess that you might want. Well, I'm presuming you might want different outputs depending on certain things, but
Oh, that was, I think, a condition, an operator. So let's see if there's a switch somewhere. No, no.
I think that's something for the audience to try out.
Yeah,
The first person to give us the correct answer there might win a prize.
yeah.
They also might not as well. You showed us how to export for Power BI.
Yes.
Um, it, it didn't look like that data set was a real-time data or live query data set. Is there any way to kind of do live query reporting in Power
No,
BI?
no,
Okay.
not in Power BI. You have to, publish to the service, and you are under the restrictions of updating. I can't remember. It's 8 times a day or something like that. I think it is. So that's where. So if you work business hours, that's once an hour. You can have live updates or have the data updated.
Okay.
So no live data connection.
Well, talking about live data, which I'm presuming the dashboard data is live data, have you found yourself sort of creating lots and lots of dashboards to store all these charts for these queries on, or not?
We have currently 4 screens in the office showing all kinds of different charts and lists and stuff. So
Yeah,
we actually had to buy widescreen monitors to fit them all in.
yeah,
At some point, you go nuts in creating queries because once you get the hang of it, it's actually a lot of possibilities once you collect your data into a single repository. So you can
yeah.
cross join and stuff like that. And that actually it opens up a lot of opportunities.
Cool. Management love charts, don't they, on screens?
Yes.
a very quick story from my past. We had Oracle database support at one time, and our software stopped working. So we had a management visit in the data center, and some bright spark just took a screen grab in the end because we couldn't get the software working, and just showed that on the screen whilst management were walking around. So we had all the green boxes.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
It worked. Moving swiftly on. I shouldn't really have said that, should I?
No.
Moving swiftly on. So obviously all the queries you write, you can store yourself into a version control system, but is there any way of actually hooking up these queries that you've got stored in Azure into some kind of version control, or is it automatically versioned or not?
There's no version control within the Query Explorer here. So you store them within the application insights service. So
Right.
in this DevOps logs, I have these queries stored.
Yeah.
Process history plus these my queries. If
So
I
do you
go
know
into
sorry,
yeah,
I was
yeah,
just going
no,
to say, when you're editing, then do you take a copy, or were you about to say you edit them outside of there?
no, I don't have a means of editing them outside. I know Azure's Data Studio is working on supporting KQL, but I don't know how far they are.
Okay.
But if you watch another, this is DevOps Pro, another log space, it's just gonna take some time to load the queries. And that's a completely different set of queries. I can share those queries with other users having access to the same application insights workspace, so to speak, or I can keep them as my own. You can see here my queries and shared, and I can then favorite them or not.
Cool.
Let's see. No. This one, I haven't stored anyone here. So these are empty. That's just the recently created application insights workspace. There are no queries
Right.
stored here, my queries or shared queries. And this one's
Okay.
still loading. Yeah, okay.
Right. So you mentioned earlier on about there was a certain cost to doing all this. Is there actually a cost to running the Kusto queries themselves? Because potentially you are accessing large data sets.
I don't have a particular price point or let me just say that it's not the querying or dashboarding that is bringing my attention to.
Yeah.
It's more like the amount of data that I'm storing in in those log spaces.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the amount of data is the one thing to keep an eye on.
Okay. Perfect. So you've already mentioned Azure Data Studio that's being worked on at this moment in time for supporting Kusto. Do you
Yes.
know if I'm guessing that might mean they're also working on VS Code support, are they?
Mm,
Hopefully.
I haven't heard about I haven't heard about it, but I
Yeah.
would suspect them to
I've not either, but I'm hoping they are. Okay, so I came across this morning, I think it was, that apparently the best practice with queries is to try and, I guess it's the same as in SQL Server, where you want to try and filter your result set as soon as possible in that data pipeline. Are there any other best practices that you want to shout out, or even working practices that just make your life easier when writing these queries?
just two of those, just project and where as soon as possible.
Right.
So you narrow down the data set that you're working with, but both in terms of number of rows and but also in number of
Yeah.
columns. It's a good old classic. Uh,
So when you're exploring data, because I think there might even be some form of top operator, isn't there? I forget what it's called. Do
it's
you ever
called
use
limit.
that then? Oh,
Yes,
limit. Right. Okay. Do you
limit.
ever use that
Uh,
then? Do you when you're sort of exploring the data
yeah,
or
but
not?
that's where we actually bucket them more often. So as I showed in which one was that? Uh, this one. So I can partition by a category of the data. so to speak. In this case, the name. So I only get the top 10 rows of each
Right.
distinct name in here. So I
Cool.
actually limit my query by that. But obviously, the limit statement on its own, I think it has an alias as well. I don't know if top actually works. No. Well, yeah, it does have alias top. So just like SQL. But
Awesome.
top is not the preferred name if you go by the books. Limit is the one. But
Right. Okay.
semantics, I guess.
Okay. Perfect. I mean, what's the best way for people to get started on this?
There is a free Perl side course by I failed to remember his name, but there's only actually one KQL course in there, so
Right.
you won't. It's a really good course, and it's I think it's a 4-hour course or something like that. So it's really taking you from basics to the more advanced stuff like this. It's really good, and it's free, I believe. It was at some point, at least.
I was just trying to do a quick search whilst you were on Plural site whilst you were talking there, but my my skills are not quick enough.
And let me
Oh,
find
hold
it.
on. Here we go. Robert Kane.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I don't know. I also came across myself when I was playing around this morning or yesterday that I think Microsoft have a free data set that you can literally load up in your own portal and play with. I don't know. I can't find the URL for that right now. I don't know if you've got it off the top of your head.
Yes, I think actually it's stated at the plural side course,
Oh, perfect.
so
Okay.
we can find it there, I believe.
Yeah. So what I'll do for the attendees is I'll try and send that across to them in follow-up materials. Okay, perfect. Well, I think that wraps up the presentation. Really appreciate you spending the time with us, Jens. I've enjoyed it, really enjoyed it. And
Yep,
there's a lot of
was
stuff for
fun.
me to try out. I think at work, I'm going to try and impress the boss and maybe get a pay rise.
Yes.
I won't tell him that you taught me how to do this, though.
No, obviously not.
So, thanks once again, Jens.
Yeah,
Really
thank you.
appreciate it. And I hope to see you all sometime soon.